behind Comixology app, which was recently acquired by Amazon. David Steinberger, Chip Mosher are back as co-founders of a new comics publisher called Distillery. This is going to feature creator-owned properties that are going to be brought to forth by such creators as James Tynion, Scott Snyder, Becky Cloonan, Jock, and Ram V, of course. So a lot of high-powered, popular creators are coming to this, which is definitely something that's going to play into this later. So yeah, this is one of the big bullet points here is something they talked about is how creators are going to own their IP. And I think that's important. Creators will own their IP and successful creators will share in the equity of the company via a 3% pool set aside for that purpose. And they even mentioned this later in this interview. That reminds me of my initial thought. This is kind of that where I get into like, okay, we're talking about a new app. We're talking about all these creators coming over to it. What does that remind me of? And what it really reminds me of is Image comic books back in the 90s and how it started. So already I'm kind of like applying what I'm reading with this article, what I'm learning about Distillery to something I know from the past. But I'm also trying to do at the same time, separate out the fact that it's maybe kind of like Image from, even though it's kind of like Image, it might be its own thing and not try to let that become a bias for me. We're getting a comment here that the EXP feed cut out completely.
Yeah, I knew it was going to happen. I could see it coming. I tried to warn everybody on our YouTube page that it was going to happen. For whatever reason, it didn't load properly. Okay. And I got an alert, so it should be back if they just refresh their page.
Okay. So hopefully if you're watching over on my channel, let's go ahead and try to go ahead and refresh that page, and hopefully you figure it out on your own.
Well, the Bronze Age Nerds page works. It was just
that's what I'm saying is if you flipped over there, you can head back to the EXP and it should be working now. All right, there we go. It's back. Thanks, Backwoods. And Twitch is fine. Awesome. Okay. So yeah, this is kind of that thought process, right? Like we're kind of like, okay, here's this thing. What is it? What does it remind me of? Is it familiar? Is it something brand new? That's something we kind of all ask ourselves when we're learning about something new, I think, or at least I do. So here's where I get to the first real point in this article that I think is worth mentioning is the kind of first couple questions here. So McDonald asks, so why? Just why? Why did you want to do this? And David Steinberger replies, because we thought things could be better, particularly for creators, and because we had some realizations about digital and the way market works here in the US for Western comics as a drop culture collectible space, that's fascinating to me. I never really thought about it that way, but it actually is true. And what does that mean? Well, drop culture is, if you're not familiar with like sneaker drops or limited edition action figures or Funko Pops, there you go.
So this company Circle, right? Like you may have seen the ads on TikTok or on social media or during the NCAA tournament. They do bottle and flavor drops all the time where you can get a special bottle that's a special size or a special color and different flavors that go into the bottle, but only for a limited time and in limited quantity. And those bottles sell on the secondary market for dumb money. And then those flavors sell out instantly. And the idea of drop culture is something that comic books really could benefit from if they figure out a way to do it properly.
Yeah. And I mean, that sort of struck like a chord with me. And not necessarily in a good or bad way, right? Like I'm still reserving that judgment call when I read something like this, but I was like, I never really thought about it that way. And it's something that gets mentioned in this article, in this interview here, right into the next part here. They say, can you explain what that means by drop culture? By the way, I have to point this out. They say drop culture exists in streetwear and style. Say Supreme. Okay, well, here, I'm an old guy that didn't understand that Supreme was a really popular clothing brand. And I actually, for a second, was like, the comic book Supreme, like the superhero from the 90s in Image. So yeah, I'm an idiot.
My brain went immediately to pizza.
There you go. Yeah.
Well, and believe it or not, there's a pizza place here in town that does that.
Oh, nice.
There are days they'll do drop like different toppings.
Okay, yeah.
So their Supreme this week might come with bison, and next week it's got old style pepperoni or what, just whatever they can source locally because they're a farm to table pizza place.
Gotcha.
Whatever they can source. It's wild.
It is wild. And I mean, there's other things that come up here. They talk about StockX, and StockX being one of their kind of big influences for this. They talk about, shoes, streetwear, vinyl toys. And this is where it gets interesting. So Steinberger goes on to say comics have that built in simply by being released on Wednesdays. The retailers bought what they bought. You have to have a pull list, or you have to be there on Wednesday if you want to make sure you're getting that book, particularly a popular one. And, like, obviously I knew that, like, intuitively you're thinking about that, but I never really made the connection there that it is in a way kind of a weekly, a monthly, drop culture kind of a thing, depending on the title. And that is true. There is sort of, especially we see things with Spider-Man 7. I think another big one this Wednesday is going to be the High Republic Adventures Quest for the Jedi. That's already getting a lot of buzz. Those comic books come, and if you didn't have them pre-ordered, we all know that if there's a buzz about that book, it sells out well ahead of pre-order. And then some retailers will put them on the shelves. Some retailers put them on the shelves for a higher price. Some retailers limit it to one per person. And then, there's people that go around buying them all up. That is sort of that kind of drop culture thing. We have resellers that then go on and further supply the market with the ones that they've purchased by increasing the price, making a profit. You guys know how it goes, but that's exactly what happens when you're talking about, like, say, a sneaker drop, for example. Like, a hot new shoe comes out, same thing happens, right? But it is sort of that same idea, although I think people in that community view it a lot differently than people in the comic book community do, because we've been doing this comic collecting thing for a long time, right? So it's just kind of an interesting point of view and something that I definitely wanted to touch on. So I'm kind of building this, this sort of preconceived sort of notion here when they talk about this with drop culture. Interesting.
There's another point in this second paragraph that was something that I was going to touch on, which is they said, we didn't have price control, of course, at our last job, but we found was that publishers were very resistant. One of the reasons we did well, I think it's because we listened to publishers and their problems. And they were really afraid of digital ruining print because it's so efficient for them. We talked about this a lot very early on. And one of the reasons we succeeded is because we were empathetic, we listened, and we understood their fear. Here's something that for me has been a big point in the comic book world for the whole 30 years I've been in it. Ever since they killed Superman, comic book retailers are afraid. They're very afraid. They're very resistant to change because they've seen the bubbles. They've seen them come and go. We just got through what I think is a deflation of the industry. And it's something that Bronze and I will probably talk about later when I have more math. But they're scared. So the resistance to change is an interesting thing. So when you can point a comic book publisher or retailer at hey, this works for this similarly niche industry. Hey, this works for sneakers. Hey, this works for pro wrestling action figures. By the way, the pro wrestling action figure market is nothing but drop culture anymore. If you want to get your favorite wrestlers an action figure, that's the only way to get it, is to know which website, Great Big Toy Store, Shop AEW, or whoever, is going to do a drop of that figure on what day at what time. Yeah. So it's good to be able to draw a direct correlation.
It is, yeah, it's good to be able to draw that correlation. Now here's kind of where the sort of devil's advocate part comes in, because that's a very popular format, and it obviously has a lot of legs in different types of collecting. But when you go up against, a lot of, dyed in the wool, hard, long old school comic book collectors, there's a resistance to some of this stuff, because what's something that comes to mind when we think about exclusive drops, exclusive variant covers, con exclusives, a lot of collectors feeling, hey, how come I can't get that item? That's something that is going to automatically be sort of the flip side to that idea of making sure that everybody has a chance at it, right? Like, the one of the things we like about open order comic books is it's not like there's any problem with anybody getting a copy of it most of the time. Sure, things can come up, but it's one of those things where it's almost like an open market. But then you bring in these exclusives, the retailer incentives, all those sorts of things, and you start to kind of have a backlash from some collectors. And there's different ways you can look at that. It's a whole topic we'll probably dive into at some point.
Well, you look at Bad Idea, right? They did the thing where the first person who got to the store and bought a Bad Idea book on a Wednesday got the button.
Yep.
Well, now that's a thing that is not only tangible but sought after by some people, that caused a lot of animosity in other people. Nick is calling. Should I answer?
Sure.
Nick, we're in the middle of a show. Are you calling about something for the show, or are you calling to remind me I forgot to do something for my job?
Sure. I'm calling about the show. It says call in with your thoughts.
I know. I just wanted to give you a hard time.
Okay.
What's up, buddy?
I'm calling about the show. It says call in with your thoughts.
Also, turn on your background.
Okay. What's up, buddy? That's going to be hard. How am I going to hear?
You should be able to hear me.
I can hear you.
You should be able to hear Bronze too.
Yeah.
I can hear Bronze.
Then
Yay.
All right. Learn something new every day. See, you can teach an old dog new tricks.
So I got to turn your radio down when you call in for sports talk to talk about, I don't know, New Jersey.
I would have to follow sports to be able to do that.
That's fair. What's up, man?
So here's a question for you guys. So for the drop culture, how do you do it with retailers? I mean, Robert Kirkman, when he finished Walking Dead, we'll call this the opposite of drop culture. He had like 3 issues solicited after 192, but then people found out that it was over with 192. So the flip of drop culture is easy. How do we do drop culture in the age of internet?
I think part of it will be understanding how they intend to do drops, right? Are they physical, tangible drops? Or are they digital drops? Are they limited drops? Are they whatever? I made the example of my water bottle, right? One of the things that they did was this sleeve that I have on the bottom of my water bottle. They only took orders for 2 hours, but then they produced whatever you want, however many they sold. So it would almost be like a rapid fire Kickstarter.
Right, but the question is how do you get all the retailers involved? How do you help the direct market? Drop culture is easy if you're working just with internet retailers. Now, how do we do it for the entire direct market? How do we excite retailers to just keep it on the down low until you put it out there? Now I'll go with Robert Kirkman again. Robert Kirkman did it well with, I can't remember the title of the book, but with Paul Azaceta. And what Robert Kirkman did, which was genius, and he's one of the few people that can afford this, he actually dropped a book and just gave it to retailers for free.
Well, he did
Solid Blood
Oblivion song where they had the signatures on the cover were different colors, or they were just very minor variants of the covers that were just mixed in. That would be one way to kind of involve it, but I think part of it is we don't know what we don't know about this particular company yet, right? Is the drop culture part of this going to be direct market?
Well, I've got mad respect for David and for Chip. They are smart guys, and I have a lot of faith in them doing that right. I just wanted to take a quick conversation about drop culture, period, in comics and how to make it work. I thought maybe I could learn something. Plus, I also wanted people to call in, so I figured if I'd call in right now, it would inspire other people to call in.
And you know what, Nick? I think you've been doing drop culture in a way since 1993.
I understand, but how do we do it now to help the entire industry as opposed to a limited amount?
Right.
Well, and real fast, before we get too far afield, I do want to kind of discuss one point, which is later on, and we would have gotten this article, but I think it's a perfect time to skip ahead and talk about it. So one of the ways that Distillery is planning on doing drop culture is a digital means. And that's interesting because it speaks to what you're asking there, Nick, about how does this help kind of the retailer spectrum. And I think this will essentially not help them at all, which is kind of interesting. They're going to sell digital copies, and they think this is kind of in plan on Wednesday when the comic drops until the following Tuesday is kind of what they're thinking about. And that's it. So the digital copies, the single issues, are going to essentially be almost like an NFT, because it'll have a record, a ledger of who's owned it. And so the other thing that they discussed, kind of why this might be something that might get some people excited, is let's say they're going to give out 10 comp copies to Scott Snyder. Well, Scott Snyder can then gift those copies, and it'll literally say like this copy belonged to Scott Snyder at one point, and people can resell them and rebuy them on the Distillery platform. So they are actually literally building in this sort of digital, almost like NFT. I hate to use that word because it's charged. But the interesting thing about that is they could also do comp copies for retailers too, where that might be part of where they might be able to get part of their kind of extra piece of that too. That could be a way they could do it, or special variant covers that the digital cover only exists for that shop or from them, and then they could give it out that way. That might be a way to do that too.
Well, and something that's interesting that and I know Chip has had these conversations, but Scout Comics.
I should get off the phone. You're losing viewers when talking to me.
Well, no, but I was going to ask you a question in just a second. But Scout Comics does what they call comic tags, right? Which are QR codes on a collectible tag for a digital comic that your local retailer can sell.
Right.
So they don't have to take the chance on ordering the book and taking up floor space, back issue space. They can have this little tag. That might be a way to do it. But let me ask you this, Nick, as a publisher.
But wait. Before you get to that, because I know I'll forget this if I don't ask this now. Mm-hmm. But isn't the whole idea of drop culture that it's there at that moment? So if you're doing a tag that you can order, you're not getting the item right away. You still have to wait then.
No, I mean, so maybe it's a digital code or something that retailers have that's only active during that window where your retailer gets kickback. But let me ask you a question as a publisher.
Sure.
When you do a book like Scar that came out a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
You do a number of store exclusives on that book, right? Like just as a, for instance, if a store were to come to you and say, I want to.
Correct. If retailers want to support it and they can present an artist that can get approved, and we can get it on time, then a retailer can do a retailer exclusive. Correct.
Okay. So if that is that, do we feel like the same or different than a drop culture type concept?
I think that it's different in that retailers are pre-selling them. Unless a retailer waits till the day it's in their hands, I do not consider that drop culture.
Got it. Okay.
That's not Supreme. That's not Supreme saying for,
right.
We're dropping these skateboards and these shirts and hoodies today. And when they're out, they're out.
Yeah.
You don't, when Supreme drops, they could have people walking in spending anywhere between $75 and $1,000.
True. No, and that's why I wanted to ask that question with you on the phone, right? Because I think to me, that feels like it feels very similar to when a shoe line puts out an exclusive shoe with a wrestler that I like.
Right.
But it is different because of what you're saying. So it's important to have both of those things. Nick, thanks for calling in, buddy. We'll let you get off the line. Other people can call in.
Everybody else call in.
By the way,
be more intelligent and more engaging than I am, please.
Oh, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for that question, Nick.
Nick put us together, and it was really a good idea on his part. So shout out to Nick for being the man behind the scenes and making this happen.
Hey, real fast.
All right, guys, have a great rest. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah, you have a great rest of your night too as well, Nick. Thank you.
All right, everybody, hit that thumbs up, please, whether you're watching now or later. And tell your friends about this show. This is actually going to be one of the most engaging, fun shows that the Experience has. And nothing would make me happier than if all the fans out there can help build this show, because this is going to be a cornerstone show. So
we just got to get rid and not sound like a frog.
I'll talk to you guys later.
See you, buddy.
Bye.
So that was awesome. Yeah, if you guys aren't familiar with Nick Barucci over on my side, he's been on the channel before as far as like coming in the chat. You probably know who he is. He is the head of Dynamite and Dynamic Forces. Fantastic guy. Everybody over here on the EXP, I'm pretty sure is familiar with Nick. He runs a lot of shows, but
He was one of our co-founders. He's
yeah. So just to recap, I know Eddie's been asking a few times, and I want to just kind of really quickly give you the rundown so you're not confused on what's going on in the show. We have been talking about it for a while. So what we're talking about is Distillery, which is this new company that's going to be producing comic books that are creator owned. They're going to be original IPs. A lot, James Tynion, Scott Snyder, a lot of guys involved with it. And they're talking about taking some elements from other things they've seen work. They came from Comixology, and they're talking about taking things from the Japanese manga digital market. They're talking about taking things from drop culture, which is specifically your question, and I'll answer that again in a second, and incorporating that into their new platform that's going to launch later this year. And the idea behind the drop culture part of it is just having these exclusive items that will come out on one day. And they compared all that to how comic books kind of work now in a way, which is if you really want a book, Spider-Man 7 was the example I gave earlier. That first Spider-Boy appearance, that was a big book a few weeks ago. People that really want that book either had to pre-order it, which it was open order and they could have, but when they found out, oh, this is going to be a first appearance, I really want to go get that comic book, they were left scrambling and running to stores that had a limited number of copies available. And those stores then, had the ability to be like, hey, I can maybe charge you more money, or you guys are in here buying stuff. Here's some other items. That's good for the retailers, theoretically. It gets a lot of people excited about the comic book. So it's kind of that interesting dynamic. And that sort of is what they're comparing the idea of drop culture being baked into comic books already, and how they're going to potentially use that as a springboard for part of their platform. We're not sure exactly how they're going to do that completely, but obviously it's something that they wanted to mention.
Yeah, and I think one thing we need to caveat is like this is a first week after the announcement interview. Right, they announced end of 2 weeks ago. So
yeah, it was like March, I think.
A week ago, this past Friday, they announced. So this is some very early stuff where they're probably still figuring out, right, how that's going to go.
Very much so.
So, they talk about drop culture, which is again something that we're kind of accustomed to as people who are sneakerheads, or I'm not really a sneakerhead, but I do like pro wrestling action figures, and that's a big part of drop culture. So like these kind of things that we're already familiar with. So it's interesting to talk about. What else did they talk about, Bronze?
Yeah, and real fast, by the way, because we're talking about digital and all this stuff real fast, I do want to make sure I point out this is not a digital only company. They are doing print comics. And, as I know what our time looks like, I want to make sure I hit this point before we miss it. One of the interesting things to me is they're doing print comics, and they are doing apparently their own distribution for those comic books is something that they brought up as well. So that's something to keep in mind. Another kind of a hot button topic is distribution of comics right now, with a lot of issues at Penguin and Lunar and people having all those kinds of issues. It's something I wanted to make sure and bring up. So like, for example, Buddy's talking about how you're paying for the pixels, right? Well, I totally understand what you mean, Buddy, and whether or not people like digital comics and all those kinds of things is a completely separate topic, and one that I would love to cover. But it is sort of part of the conversation. But they are doing digital and print, so it's not just that.
And something I will say that when Chip was and when both of these guys are actually at Comixology, that they did really well, and that I took a lot of advantage of, even as a full-time comics retailer. If there was a book I didn't know and I wanted to read, I would buy it digitally and then order myself a physical copy if I liked it, or add it to my pull list, especially if it was flying off my shelves because my customers did want it and I missed it. So rather than take one for myself, I'd sell them, buy it on Comixology, then order a reorder for myself if I could get one.
Yeah.
It's also one of the few ways you can read classic books. So like, I don't think digital is bad. I don't think you're necessarily paying for pixels, but it's this idea of sometimes it's a different way to get yourself associated with something.
Hey, Immortal Biggie Shack, thanks for popping in here, man.
That's a great username.
Oh, he's an awesome dude. He's a good guy. Go give him a follow, guys. Fun content. He does a lot of freestyle raps and stuff with comics content. It's great. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about Distillery and some other great points I want to bring up real fast that are from this article. Again, this interview with the creators. I'm actually, because I kind of lost my place on the article, I'm going to just go ahead and read you, and you can see my big face instead of trying to read the little text. A couple points about that, I'll kind of wrap up the points that Steinberger and Mosher made. They said it's absolutely going to be print and digital at the same time, simultaneously. And Mosher said the business plan started with print and they added the digital components. So it's not like this is a digital first kind of scheme to get you in. And they're like, oh, we can also do print. They actually started wanting to do this as a print business. So they just decided along the way that they were going to kind of adapt and add digital. So I don't want to like misrepresent what they're saying their business model is going to be like either. And then I mentioned that already when we talked to Nick. And the other part of that that's really cool is for the digital things we're talking about, where you're going to give out a digital copy and then they're going to pass that along, like you can sell it to other people. There's a residual royalty that's going to go back to the creator each time too. So the creator is still getting taken care of, which is an interesting point that I think a lot of people may not have thought of until this platform is out. And they're like, well, hey, wait a minute, what about the creators? Or the creators might have been upset. You got to remember, when all these creators are joining this company, a huge component of that is that creators are upset with the way that their terms work sometimes with some of the major publishers. Not all the time, of course. There's creators that are very happy with their situations, but there's some that want more control. They want more money. They want, like when films come out with their characters involved, they want to make sure that they're receiving royalties for that. And this sounds like they are very smart in thinking about that ahead of time. And going ahead and offering ways to take care of that creator, throughout the pipeline there.
Something that's worth noting in the way this kind of sounds like it's structured is that they're creator-owned books. So the creator gets their slice just like they would with Image or any other creator-owned publisher. But then what this company is doing is they're setting aside a portion,
3%
for creators, 3%, which isn't a ton. Let's be real. Of the ownership share for these creators. So that way, when the company prospers, these creators get a little taste. So it wouldn't shock me one bit if you don't see other distillery titles at James Tinian's table at a convention. It wouldn't shock me if you don't see presented by distillery next to these guys' names when you see them places promoting this company, because as the company grows, so grows the amount that 3% pays out.
Yeah. 100%. Because I mean, think about it. It's like kind of a high tide raises all ships, right? And that's a very important philosophy.
No, one of the companies that kind of did a version of this, it was SourcePoint Press. And the idea was SourcePoint, when they founded Oxeye Media, which is the parent company of SourcePoint Press now, you could buy in and you could buy shares of the company. So when the gaming side of the company had a massive year during 2020 because Harry Potter was playing their new game release on YouTube because he didn't have anything else to do, and the company went crazy, everybody got a little bit back, including the comic people who weren't able to sell because they weren't at conventions or whatever. So there are definite benefits in terms of the long term to that for these creators. It's just going to be interesting to see how long term does it take for these guys to really be making their effort here. I saw that Backwoods had a comment.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I kind of found where I was at in the article here, so we'll kind of go back.
Well, real quick, before we jump into that, Backwoods. Yeah. I may be way off here because I'm only about a year into comics, but I've been around collectibles for a while. Is there clear lines between drop culture and manufactured scarcity?
It's a good question. I would say that, they're kind of, it's almost like a Venn diagram where you have your manufactured scarcity on one circle and your drop culture on the other. And there's a little bit of a crossover here because actually, you know what? That's a perfect thing. Let me scroll back up to where I saw that.
Yeah.
So one of the things that they wanted to do is influence some digital scarcity. And that's literally the term they use. So I want to make sure, it's a little different than manufactured scarcity, but we're talking about scarcity, right? So McDonald, the interviewer in this case, asked but will there be digital scarcity? And Steinberger answered, yes, exactly. So the idea is the vertical marketplace is distillery.co only. People can come in and buy single issues the day it comes out, probably Wednesday morning, and we'll figure out long-term how it's working. So what they're trying to do is replicate the fun of collecting print single issues in the digital marketplace. Now, whether or not you enjoy that or whether or not you like that concept, I'll leave that up to every individual to decide. But it is an interesting idea, right? Because that is kind of what we do. And I know a lot of people that are into like collecting the DC NFT comic books or the Marvel NFT drops, that kind of thing. There is kind of this interesting idea where some collectors do want that. It also sounds like, that's going to be a completely optional thing to do for people too. I don't want it to, this is that devil's advocate side of thinking about things, guys. Like, if you take this kind of concept and you're very opposed to one part of it, keep in mind they're also offering print comic books. They go on to say, since I'm kind of skipping ahead here because I don't want to miss this point again, they're going to do like trade style releases. It's actually a big part of their model, both print and digital. So it's not like, there was that thing with Bad Idea, for example, what a lot of people had a problem with, including me, because I couldn't get the comic books when they first came out, was like, well, great, you're going to only do this one run, and then you're going to do this not first print thing, but like unless a store orders all the issues, they can't get it. Unless they're an authorized retailer, they can't get it. How am I going to read the stories? That was my big concern, right? There's going to be several ways for people to go back and purchase these things later on. So I wanted to kind of make sure we address that, because it is kind of a new concept. It's kind of a confusing concept, and it's something I wanted to make sure that we touched on.
I think to kind of go into that question too as well, when we talk about print, there's underprinting and creating manufactured scarcity, right? Which is printing less than you should in order to be able to say you sold out. And then drop culture is more of a limited edition. We're only going to print this many, so there's only going to be this many for sale. Right? It's one is deceiving and one is intentional. And when you go to a sneaker drop, you're buying one of 1,000 pairs of sneakers. Right? Like, you're buying a limited number. Whereas with this, with manufactured scarcity, you're buying it because you don't know how many there are. And you may not get one because you don't know how many there are. So I think it's some of it's a matter of transparency, right? Where the company's got to be upfront with how they handle their business. And I think that will be important.
Yeah, 100%. And it kind of gets to this sort of next level kind of thought process here, because we've kind of gone over a lot of the basics of what distillery is and what they're offering. And really a lot of this came down to initially what sparked the idea for this episode is Kyle came to me with a post that was written in response to some of this that touched on some interesting points. Without name dropping and talking about who that was necessarily, dive into each point, I do want to kind of address some of the second order consequences of some of this concept and what it might mean for like retailers, what it might mean for collectors down the road. And this is, again, that kind of, devil's advocate approach where it's taking the idea as it's presented. Here's what they're talking about doing. Well, what is the other side? What is the objection to some of this? And one of those objections that I'll talk to you about real fast is the idea that these creators are sort of like going off to do this certain set of stories, and they're going away from their ongoing stories that they were doing at publishers like Marvel, DC, Image, etc. And then it's basically a little bit like Substack, where that was happening, where you have like a great creative mind, like like a Tinyan, right? And now they're just doing these exclusive stories that aren't tied into any greater universes, and it kind of almost puts those stories in a bubble for people that don't interact with this. It's an interesting concept. It's a way that I think that we have to kind of worry about diluting the market a little bit. It's kind of, I think, where some of that kind of comes in, and retailers that may not want to carry these or may not be interested in it. All of a sudden we're missing these voices from the market, and we're kind of getting worse stories maybe because some of the best writers are over there, or worse art. Now, here's where I'll kind of come in right away with, because I saw that comment, and that was one of the things I've heard about this is, oh, great, you got these creators doing another story at a place that I'm not going to read it. Well, first of all, you can try to go check it out, and you may not want to do that, but that's one thing you could do. And here's the other thing. I think that in a way, getting publishers like the big three, Marvel, DC, Image, or even some other ones to look for some different talent isn't a bad thing. I think that we have a real problem in comic books right now with stories. And I don't think I'm the only one that thinks that. I think there's a lot of people out there that, some of it's editorial. A lot of it could be editorial, like how we, keep restarting continuities, or how we keep clinging to continuity. It's kind of one way or the other. Ideas aren't original. People have issues with, one type of content or another. Like they don't want this type of content in their comic books. I think we all know what I'm talking about. And then there's people that are diametrically opposed to that. And they say, no, I do want this type of content. There's all these kind of different things where it's almost like the marketplace of ideas is maybe not as diverse as we want it to be. What do I mean by that? I mean, like, maybe we need some new writers. Maybe we need some new artists, presenting some ideas for those big publishers. Maybe we need them to take more chances. I think one of the things that happened when you had all the creators leave for Image back in the 90s is, you drew a bunch of really talented people to one company. They started a bunch of new things, and not all those things were successful, right? For every Spawn, which is still ongoing today and is super successful, you had a Deathmate Black Brigade. And I, by the way, I love some of those titles, but I admit they were very thin on story often, and they featured a lot of cool art, and there was pros and cons of that, but it did kind of bring in some new artists and some new writers to those other companies. And it may have taken them a while to find their footing, but in the end, bringing in some of those other voices led to some really cool storylines. It led to some shakeups for some long-standing titles that I think some people enjoyed, some people didn't enjoy, but it gave us new comic books and new stories that our people remember to this day, or things that have become almost like retro again. Like I've seen people like wax poetic about the Clone Saga, which is crazy to me. But it does happen. And I'm not saying, hopefully this brings about a bunch of new Clone Sagas. I'm just saying that, maybe there's a chance that we'll bring in some new writers because of this.
But Todd McFarlane leaving Marvel opened the door for Dan Slott. If Todd McFarlane stays at Marvel, the air gets sucked out of the room, because he's going to work on every big book. You're never going to get to Dan Slott's insane run on Spider-Man. You're never going to get to some of these great works that are coming out now. You're never going to get to I'm going to blank on names now, but I think part of this has to be, we have to move around to make room for other ideas. One of my good friends, a guy named Marvell Jones, tells a story about these guys would get fired at Wednesday from Marvel. They'd walk across the street and start working on Thursday at DC. And then they'd get fired the next Wednesday from DC after they did a book, walk back across the street, get rehired at Marvel. And that's how the industry has been for a long time. And so these guys who are on Kickstarter, on Indiegogo, who are out here self-publishing, are trying to break the doors down.
Yeah.
And there's no room in the room for them. Jay made my point. Cullen Bunn has more books out than, he must be the Tom Clancy of comic books at this point. He's got a book out every month, every week. And I think having people move to new publishers or work with publishers they've not worked with before gives an opportunity for somebody else to step into that role and take it. And I know Dan Slott's not for everybody. I hear you.
Yeah.
By the end of that run, I was pretty over it too. But that run was long and historic. Yep. You can't diminish what it was, even if it wasn't always great. But it would have never happened if Todd would have called him up and been like, "Hey, I want to write Spider-Man." They'd have fired Dan Slott in a heartbeat, and he'd have just been another guy.
Yeah, and I mean, think about. We don't know. We don't know what these original stories are going to be over on Distillery. You could have the next Walking Dead over there. You could have the next American Vampire. The next, you insert your own indie title here. You guys get where I'm going with that. We really don't know yet, but we have some talented folks over there. And I know that there is kind of this thing where comic book collectors have a tendency to be set in our ways. We really do. We see something happening. We see, a certain creator with a certain company for a long time. And here's my example. I was really sad to see Jim Lee leave Marvel, leave Image, head over to DC, because I'm not primarily a DC guy. Much love to everybody who is. I love plenty of DC stuff, but it's not my bread and butter. And he's been at DC for a long time. And now I'm like, man, Jim Lee is probably my favorite artist of all time. I would love to see him back on some Marvel stuff, right? And I'm guilty of that. But if that had never happened, I never would have gotten those amazing Batman, images he's drawn that are iconic. They're some of the most iconic Batman drawings ever. Superman, some of the work he's done over there, some of the Justice League stuff. It is just jaw-dropping, gorgeous stuff. And I never would have experienced that if he never went to DC. Now, maybe I'm ready for him to go to another company at this point because he's been doing it for a while. But it is one of those things that we need to be aware of. There's always that potential that something's going to come in and do, amazing, stories, amazing art that we're going to get to experience over at this company. The next Something Is Killing the Children. You got the guy that created that over there right now.
Right. And Frog Brawler made a comment. It feels like Tinian's writing everything right now. And he's okay with that. And see, I feel like Tinian's maybe spread a little thin.
Yeah.
Some of the stuff that he's coming out with just isn't to the caliber I expect from Tinian. And part of that is because these stories are getting into the weeds, and that's fine. You gotta get into the weeds to tell a good story sometimes. But sometimes it feels like he's just like, all right, I got 10 more pages I gotta write today, and then I can eat. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's bad that he's writing great stuff. But if there's a company out here who's willing to give him a taste, that's willing to make his life a little different, willing to make him a little more whole, maybe he stops worrying about how many Image books and how many DC books can I get out in a month.
Yeah, and a lot of interesting opinions just came through about Tinian. I also saw a great comment from Sean, which is that I'd love to see Alex Ross on an indie book. 100%, right? Like that would be something really cool to see. I totally agree with that. But I also understand that, for everybody who, Kyle was kind of just expressing this a little bit too, is that you get spread a little too thin and maybe it's not the best thing for your work. I think Tinian definitely has a crazy work ethic from what I've seen and people I've talked to. So
Cullen's the same way, by the way.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. They're the most active writers in the medium date. 100%. 100%. And yeah, starting to enjoy Ramby's work. I agree with that too.
Yeah.
So some of those comments, guys, we might be, I think we're running a little low on time for this week's show, but on next week's show, we're going to have the phone lines open, keep pasted for those topics, because some of those comments you guys are making, those are the perfect things that you can call in and talk to us about. I know, like for my shows, if you're used to my stuff, we're really used to that live chat interaction. This is actually going to be your chance to call in and discuss some of that stuff with us and offer your devil's advocate's perspective on some of those opinions for us as well.
Preston, as long as he keeps writing 007 as well as he is right now, I don't care what Philip Kennedy Johnson does.
Yeah. And, it just kind of comes to me, sort of to wrap up this idea about what some of the backlash is here. And we didn't even touch about it. So I'm going to go real fast on the retailer perspective. Like, how could this be bad or good for retailers? And I think that that's a really interesting kind of way to look at this again. This is that second order of thinking where you take the concept and you go, okay, what is the consequence of that? What is it going to mean for everybody in the community? Not just the collectors, not just the creators, the other third arm of that, which is the retailers. And when it comes to retailers, I think that there's some potential here. We mentioned a little bit of it earlier, if you were watching the whole show, where we talked about having that sort of potential to give retailers maybe their own exclusive as far as digital covers go, where they can, then sell and resell those. That's an interesting way that it might help kind of spread, some of the love back to those retailers. They could get their own kind of cover artists to make some digital art or something like that. And that could be a way they could sell books. I'm kind of speculating at this point, but there are ways to do that. Plus, they are going to be able to sell the print books as well. So, and they're going to be able to order those and get them from a different distributor, which is going to be Distillery, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, something else we didn't talk about, and I think it's a big part of that retailer part. So maybe we do make this a two-parter, or if you don't have to go anywhere, we can keep rolling.
Oh yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, I don't. We can go a little long. We're the last show of the night tonight, so
okay.
We can run. Especially because with my title, I get to make those decisions.
Absolutely.
And I'm feeling pretty good right now. But the format is different. Like the format they're talking about, something that's going to be important in this retailer conversation is the format of the books. And this is where that post I shared with you really started to get devolving. They're talking about they want to do oversized 48-page formats.
Yep.
So a little bigger, a little bigger.
And they specifically mentioned DC Prestige format. So I'm thinking that that's what
The
they have
Black
in mind.
Label or Aftershock.
Yep. Yep. And I think that that's a really interesting point of view because they're approaching it, I think, from the impression I got reading the interview is they're approaching it maybe more from the creator and reader, as far as like the actual reader background, where, okay, you have a bigger book, you have more space for artwork, you can kind of spread out the page a little bit longer story. They also mentioned, you got to remember that they have background with comicsology, right? They talked about the price of a single issue on comicsology had to have parity with the physical issue, meaning that if your comic book was $4.99, then it would be $4.99 physical and digital. Of course, they do have sales every once in a while, but when the book first launches, that's the price it would be. And they pointed out that the value proposition of a digital comic book, which is a pretty short experience. I think, a lot of people out there, depending on the book, of course, you might be able to read a modern comic book in 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and then you're done, right? You're done with that particular experience. Back in the day, comic books used to take longer to read because there were more, there was thought bubbles, there was more dialogue, there was more stuff going on. But now it's a pretty quick read, a lot of, big splash pages, and you kind of get through them pretty fast. So is that really worth the full $5? That's another interesting element to this. So if they're talking about offering that bigger value proposition for a single issue, more story is in a longer format or in a larger format for people, that's interesting. But it obviously presents the problem for pretty much every comic book collector, which is now I have to store these giant books. This is very much something that I think a lot of collectors shy away from. It's also like, I talk to retailers too, and they're like, oh, now I got to buy more magazine bags and boards, and I got to have magazine boxes to store these things. And, we've even seen DC go away from it, which is interesting. They actually mentioned that in the interview too, the creators, because they've really kind of gone away from this prestige format. We're not seeing it offered anymore. It's been a while. Go ahead.
The introduction I had to this size wasn't DC Black Label or wasn't Aftershock's One Shock books. It was Humanoids. This is the European magazine size, which, if you're like me and you're a 2000 AD addict, the size of the book I'm talking about. They're a little bigger. They're a little more magazine-y. I like them because it's more content.
Yeah.
I can read especially with ads, I can read a modern comic in about 7 minutes. That's a huge, that's a problem for me if I'm spending $10 on a book. So I want content.
Yep.
So having a little bit bigger book that's a little bit more arty with a little bit more space and a little more content is a good idea. And that's, Steve, that's kind of my thing, right? Like, selling as an alternative to storing. I don't propose that anybody order to sell out. I think that's a dangerous game that is being played in comic books right now, because it means that the second wave of people don't have anything to buy. When somebody hears about it from somebody, if you order the number you'll sell out of, then when somebody comes into your store, there's nothing for them to purchase, right?
Could also mean could mean the end consumer too, as far as
for sure.
Yeah.
But at the same time, order conservatively until you figure out what a book is going to do, so you don't have that many to store. Everybody has to do what's right for their business at the end of the day. And that I mean that as retailers, I mean that as consumers, right? Like, you have to manage your budget, your business. And the thing about that is, if you're not doing that properly, you're going to dislike the outcomes you're getting. So if you're storing too many books of the wrong size, then maybe you're not handling your business correctly and you're buying too many of those things, either as a retailer or a collector or as a secondary market.
Yeah. And I just want to touch on this real fast because Nick brings up a great point, and that is very germane to what we're talking about here, which is that 2 of their investors are foreign publishers. And that's true. There's a French publisher involved, and the other one's, I believe, Japanese, right? And when you talk about what Steinberger learned from these, he talks about it in the interview a little bit. He learned from the folks that run those companies, learned a bit about the French distribution model, a little bit about the Japanese distribution model. And what I really liked reading and was really fascinating to me was the stuff about the Japanese distribution model and how over there they just don't do single issues. They do trades, essentially, like collected volumes, right? And Kodansha, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're talking about that, that is a very important topic for something like I've heard a lot of people that are really tapped into the industry talk about this. Is when you talk about digital sales and why they're not doing very well in the United States compared to, say, Japan, for example, a lot of it could be tied into the value proposition, which is, you're getting that very expensive, small, single issue. You're digesting it very quickly. Kyle's doing it 7 minutes. I'm doing about 10. I take a little bit longer. And you read that and then you're done.
Having to read 15 books a week to review on Tuesday nights.
Yeah.
Plus all my other stuff I have to get done in a day. You learn to read quick, man.
You got to. 100%. And so I think that, that's a good point is they're talking about maybe being a little bit more flexible. I read between the lines on what Steinberger was saying there a little bit. And I think that he's basically saying our hand was a little forced on what we had to charge per issue. There was a little bit of a has to be lockstep parity. I'm interpreting that. Maybe that's not the case, but I kind of feel like that's what he was saying. And so if they can do a little bit cheaper single issues digitally, or, they can offer that kind of special on the trade where you get like a better deal for buying it up front instead of having to wait for a sale. Because there were sales all the time on Comixology. I was a big Comixology guy. I was pretty much everything I bought on there was on sale at one point or another. And the reason is because, I prefer binge read anyway, like Something Is Killing Children. I read it volume by volume by volume, bam, bam, bam. And I think a lot of people are that way. So I think that's one of the things that I love to see them talking about is what makes this successful in other territories and how could we maybe try to offer and emulate that success over here in the US territory.
So when I was coming up, it was really hard to get manga in the US. You had to know the specific store to go to when their truck came in and which weeks their manga shipments came in. And you had to skip school to get it. Because if you didn't, you lost it. And one of the things we all found was that if one of our friends could buy a Shonen Jump magazine or something like that, we could pass it around. Same way Thrasher magazine got passed around if you were in the skateboard community or whatever, right? It was how you got your stuff. But the thing about that style, the Japanese style and this Euro style, is that that's what it is, right? They're these bigger sizes, and they're fitting an Americanized version of storytelling into a format that's tried and true and worldwide recognized. Whereas the American-sized comics aren't necessarily as recognizable in Europe. I have 2 nephews who live in England right now. When they get their Spider-Man books, somebody put, it's a pain in the ass to store them in my boxes. Well, guess what? When I send American comic books to my nephews, they don't fit in their boxes either because their boxes are much bigger because they're buying these Euro size. So 90% of the world is used to one thing and we're used to another. There's got to be some in the middle, right? And I think that's part of who they're targeting. I don't care about the size of the book. I want the content to be good. I'll figure out how to store it.
Yeah, it's almost like a little bit of if you build it, they will come kind of a thing. Because I think that there's look, I'm a very OCD collector in the loose sense of the word OCD that we all use as collectors. It seems like if 4 volumes of the spine of one trade paperback are red with white writing and then the next one's white with red writing, you're like, what the hell? And it frustrates us, right? And I think that that's maybe where not just physically. Some people get a little put out by having to, buy a magazine box or whatever it is to store their stuff, but also just like sort of like as collectors, we sort of want everything to be kind of one way or the other. If we're a trade collector, if we're a single floppy collector, but I think that ultimately, if the story and the art are good, I think it erases a lot of the concerns that people will have, and if they're worth reading, then that's a different story. Also, there's a lot of people that are probably going to read these books digitally, and that's not a concern for them, because storing the digital file is just going to be a little bit more space maybe or something, and that's about it because it's a bigger issue.
Yeah, I for me, like, and this is the part of it, right? I will forgive an awful lot if you give me The Killing Joke, right? Give me something of that quality, and I will forgive an awful lot.
Yeah,
I'll pay a lot more than I would generally pay. I will find a box if you give me something of that quality. And at the same time, I think part of what we've seen in the past with this mentality is that Euro-sized books haven't done well in the United States because, especially for companies like Humanoids and some of these others that are coming in, the content doesn't translate. I've read some great stories from Humanoids that, unless you read them in the original French, the English just doesn't sync, man. It doesn't jive. And I don't read French real good. So I have to kind of slug through it.
Bonjour.
Baguette. But it's that idea that when you have something that's different, your first wave of it to get people interested has to be fire. You can't lay an egg first time out the gate. You only have one chance to make a first impression, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so whatever content they drop first, in whatever format and whatever methodologies they're going to use, has got to be Steve Vendetta. I only know that as a swear word from Shorzy. But it has to be fire. If it's not, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle all the time.
Yeah.
And so that's what scares me for them. Not the format, not the pushback from retailers, not any of this. It's that I'm really worried that they're going to want to launch with Tinian, or they're going to want to launch with one of these names that is a massive name, not necessarily with the best content.
Well, two things. First thing is I know we flashed it earlier, so I don't know if that was Jay or you, Kyle, but I always like to thank the super chats personally. I just hadn't quite gotten to there yet in the chat. Comic Journey, thank you so much. I'm glad you're enjoying the show. I'm glad you're enjoying the show so much that you decided to donate a super chat. I really appreciate it. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for that, sir.
Absolutely. And before we continue, if you're watching on Bronze Age's channel, please come over and follow on The Experience. Hit subscribe, click the bell. If you're following on The Experience, head over and hit Bronze Age Nerds channel. Hit subscribe, click the bell. The only way this show is going to grow is if everybody shows up and everybody has a voice on this show. Even if I don't currently, you always do.
And we're going to do this for a couple weeks. We're going to do the simulcast thing just so that my viewers know where to find me on Monday nights over here. But after that, we will only be streaming, every week over here on the EXP. So make sure that you're following along and subscribed and kind of getting that habit and spread the word. We'd really appreciate that. It's kind of weird. You guys don't usually hear me say like and subscribe, but we'll do it over here on this channel. Yeah, so I think when it does come down to, I want to get caught up with some of the comments here too. Also, when it comes down to is, if you have a good enough product, it's probably going to be something that people are going to buy. The other thing I was going to get to is that they're doing an anthology as their kind of opening book. So they're going to get a lot of the people that are kind of those big headlining names involved in that first release, and hopefully something in there is good for everybody. So that is something that I wanted to point out, because they're going to kind of fire all the cannons, it seems like, and hopefully at least one of those stories resonates with readers, because otherwise, you're right, like unless they have content that's going to keep people coming back, no one's going to come back. It doesn't matter. And then, hey, we got Bueller in the house. Thank you so much for coming in, Travis. We appreciate you stopping by. Preston says he did collect heavy metal magazines when they came out, so I would buy a comic book that size. However, I wouldn't buy more than a few per month.
And that's something that I think Distillery and every publisher right now. I talked about variant covers last week, and every comic book publisher needs to understand the economy of the economy right now. You've only got so much to spend on this stuff. So if they're going to make a bigger book and ask for a few more dollars, they need to understand what that means in terms of the limits that it's going to put on the consumer, the limits that that's going to put on the retailer, and what it's going to do to other publishers. If I had to spend $8 on a Distillery book that I like, that's 2 books that I could buy from Marvel and DC at $4 or $3.99 that I now can't buy. It just is what it is. And it's the same when you're doing a dozen variant covers. It's the same when you're doing anything, right? The economy is the economy. And if you're not looking at all aspects of it, you're shortchanging yourself in the long term. So just because the book is bigger, I'm willing to spend a little more money, but that doesn't mean that something else isn't going to have to get cut out. Now, for me, it'll start with the extra shot of espresso on my way to the comic book shop on Wednesday mornings after being here late Tuesday nights. That's where it'll start. It won't affect my local comic shop. It will affect my local coffee shop.
Yeah, the cheesecake of life is only so big, and the more little slices you cut out of it, that's how it's going to go. I also want
cheesecake references for the entire life of this show.
It's going to be a running joke, man. It's here forever. That's a callback to last week's show. If you're not familiar, you go back and watch it after the show if you want. On hot takes. I also want to kind of address this real fast. Sean asked, what are your thoughts on the prestige size stuff as it pertains to the bigger format being easier to read for those who have a hard time reading an American sized book? And this is a big chunk of why I read digitally. So I love this question, and his follow-up was that could be a selling point. And I think definitely, because I'll be honest with you, let's talk about a real hard fact that a lot of people aren't really willing to discuss. Most comic book readers are not 20-year-olds. They're actually, us older folk who may or may not have vision issues. And I'll tell you, it is a lot easier for me to read on digital. It's one of the reasons that I read digitally is because of my vision. And I need new glasses, and I can get that all sorted out, and I'll be great for another 6 months to a year reading print comic books. But it is something where it's harder for me to read, and having a bigger page. When I've read some of those like Black Label releases, when I read some magazines, some stuff like that, or some of the larger trades or whatever, it's so much easier for me to read, and I enjoy doing that quite a bit. Obviously with digital, you can kind of pinch to zoom, which is a huge thing. It's actually pretty fun, by the way, to actually be able to zoom in and see some of the detailed artwork and stuff like that too, every once in a while. But I think that's 100% something that could be a selling point, Sean, for a certain segment of readers. Not everybody. I'm not going to sit here and say that's the biggest thing in the world, but I think it's a good point. It's kind of that, that thought process of what could make a big difference to people. Most of these people that read are a little bit older. We don't have a lot of young readers in the business anymore. So the more young readers we can bring in, great. But we also need to keep us older folks that are actually reading those comic books and picking them up every month too.
Yeah. I found out at 34 that I need bifocals because I'm old. And, so rather than get that, I have 2 pairs of glasses. I wear a different pair of glasses here on the air so I can read your comments than I do to read comic books, than I do to read, magazines, than I do to watch TV. It's dumb. But when I read on my iPad, oh, that's a comma. Okay, that makes more sense now. I'm going to buy a bigger iPad so it's easier for me to read my comics. I love the idea of digital formatting where I can read it. But I also like the idea of a bigger book. I didn't realize you were saying these are 2. This is the difference, between the 2 sizes. I grabbed 2 keys, which is interesting to me, but there you go. That's the difference in the sizes.
And I mean, it's one of those things where it's not like a massive difference, but it's like I was reading the Birds of Prey stuff that came out on Black Label from Amanda Connor and Jimmy Palmiotti. They did like the oversized prestige format, and I'm a big fan of Amanda Connor's artwork, for example. And going through and reading that, I was like, man, this is kind of cool. I actually really dig this. I also read the Harleen series that Stepan Sejic did. That was another phenomenal read in that format. So it is this kind of situation where you can kind of get into this kind of format war thing almost, where you have like true IMAX 70 millimeter presentation where you get it on the big screen, you get a little bit extra space. That actually can make a difference. It's not necessarily 1-to-1, but I think it's definitely a distinguishing factor. Yes, of course, you always can bust out the old magnifying glass, but that'll hurt your
Unless
eye.
you want to read comics outside, you wind up burning the pages, Steve.
Well, and speaking of that, handling, right? That's another reason for where digital can kind of be interesting. Sorry, I knew I was going to butcher that as soon as I said it, Steve. Thanks for the correction there. But handling comic books, there's certain books that, like, yes, I can handle a comic book and carefully, read it, and that's totally fine. I can do that, no problem. Been doing it for 35 years and had no problem with it. However, I now have a 4-year-old that runs around the house just spontaneously doing whatever she wants because she's a 4-year-old. And I don't necessarily want to be handling, a Hulk 1 in 81 around her too carefully and reading it. So that's another interesting point too. Travis says, Comics Bueller, Aftershock started going very heavy on prestige format. Almost half of their lineup, their sales in those books plummeted in comparison to the regular format. That's a good point too. It's a good point. I do think that launching this way, it'll be really interesting to see what Distillery's feedback is on this. It was one of the things that stuck out to me when I was reading, the press release, reading this interview, that's going to be a thing for people. There's people that literally, we all know there's comic book collectors that won't buy a slab, or they only buy slabs, or they only buy trade paperbacks. You're already kind of like shrinking your market a little bit in one way, because there are collectors that are going to see that and be like, I don't want that. That's not for me. Readers, collectors, whatever the case may be. And there's a lot of people I think are willing to kind of look past that. Maybe it'll draw in more readers than it detracts, but it is something that is a very solid point. Is that other people have tried, like I mentioned earlier, DC's gone away from doing it too. So you have to imagine there was either printing costs, sales, something involved with that as well.
I think there's a lot of factors, right? Yeah. And I'm going to start coughing in a second, so I'm going to make this point quick. I think if you launch saying this is what we're doing, people are prepared for what you're doing going in. Whereas Aftershock launched doing one thing and then started doing another thing too much and then found no way to go back. I also think that entering the market post-pandemic, which some of the fallout we know about from the pandemic were paper shortages, printer shutdowns, some of these things that really affected the industry overall. Some of Aftershock's problem was some of the printers could only do the bigger format when they were printing them in Canada and in Europe so that they could get them here when they couldn't print in China or wherever else they were printing. And at the same time, when the paper shortage hit, it hits the guys who are doing the bigger format harder because they're using more paper. So it's this weird kind of miasma that we've waded through, that we're kind of on the other side now and things have sort of stabilized, that gives a company like Distillery a chance, whereas some of these other companies who sort of dipped their toe in the oversized market didn't.
Well, and not only that, you got to think about just this sort of shake off that we've had of the bubble too, which we had a lot of people that were, for better or worse, a little bit like an echo of the 90s, buying comic books only for investment purposes too. And I think we've gotten rid of some of the bandwagon investors. I'm not saying it's all gone. Some of us were all bandwagon investors all along anyway as collectors, but there's an element that was happening where certain books were being bought up en masse because of the hype around, oh man, these things are hitting left and right. And I need to, go out and buy them. And if you are after this kind of post-pandemic kind of era and you're in this, out of this bubble of collecting and investing that was happening somewhat, it's still kind of there. I think you're going to have more pure readers and collectors. So it's like if they'd launched a year and a half ago versus now, it'd be really interesting to see what would have happened to them. But now that they're launching at this point, I do think that you have this potential that any numbers we see from them, if it's a strong number, that could be a good base to grow on. And along with that, I really want to point out there's also, like Comics Computer is saying, don't forget shelf space at comic shops. There's only so much shelf space. 100% true.
Yeah,
but keep in mind, there are multiple ways to read these comic books. It's not like they're only releasing physical, oversized prestige format. It's not like they're only releasing digital. It's not like they're only releasing trade and digital and physical trades. They're doing all of those things. So, you do have ways to get into this stuff from every different angle. And I think that that's smart. If they came out and they were only doing these oversized releases physically, or if they were only doing digital, I would say that this is a very dangerous prospect as far as when that could succeed. But now you have the chance to bring in either side of the aisle there.
And I just had a thought that for me is kind of this home run concept. And I can't believe I didn't have it sooner. I have been, pardon my French, bitching that at the end of every superhero movie, it doesn't say, find out more about these characters or find the source material for this movie at your local comic shop. Head over to comicshoplocator.com. And here's where comic shops are, or something that pointing people back to the local comic shop. If
Agreed.
You've got a book written by Tinian from them that you buy digitally, Tinian is also writing Something is Killing the Children and yada, 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 available at your local comic shop. Now, I'm not saying they need to promote other companies' books, but what they can say, if you like this author, find more of their work at your local comic shop. That's a way you can grow the industry and be a digital presence, right? Digital's not going to help the local comic shop directly unless you're pointing people to the local comic shop from digitally. We're a digital presence here in the experience, but we on every show mention the local comic shop. We talk about Comic Shop Locator. We have shows that are sponsored by Comic Shop Locator because we know getting people to the local comic shop is important. Chip and David aren't dumb. They know that too. So they're going to find a way to point people to the local comic shop, even if they're buying digital, even if they're buying into the drop culture concept. They're going to push people to the local comic shop because they understand that their company can't exist in only one of these facets. They need all of them to hit.
Yeah. Well, and not only that, you mentioned that, and I agree. Marvel and DC with these big movies should be doing that. But here's the interesting thing: is DC did start putting at the end of like their trailers, they started putting some suggested reading, which I'm not saying is the same thing, but it's smart, right? Like it's an idea that, and also by the way, sometimes the ones they choose are a little confusing. Like, really, you're going to send somebody to go read that editorial mess first? But it is interesting that they are having that suggested reading. Like, if you're interested in Blue Beetle, here's some things you can go read. I think that's fascinating. And I wish, like you're saying, I wish more of these, Hollywood partnerships would embrace that, get us back into comic book shops, get us new readers. It helps them in the long run too, because if you have people that are, dyed in the wool reading comic books and they're ever since Iron Man came out or ever since the Avengers came out or ever since, they're a big Blue Beetle fan now because of the movie, get them reading comic books. It helps us all out because they're going to be more invested in those feature movies. They're going to be more invested in the comic books. Getting money into comic books is very important. And it kind of ties into something I'm going to use to kind of, transition into some of the wrap up from the topic that I think is important for tonight. We need more readers. We need more collectors. I try to talk about this all the time because, it's that devil's advocate approach. There's a lot of, I hate to use this word, but it's true. There's a lot of gatekeeping in the comic book community that tries to say like comics need to be this, collectors need to do this. This is the way I collect. This is the right way. Well, I'm going to challenge you to think about it from the opposite perspective. If you happen to have that particular feeling about one type of comic book collecting or reading or investing or whatever it might be, think about it from what would it be like if we had more readers? What would it be like if we had more collectors? What would it be like if we had more investors? And if you're thinking about distillery and you're thinking about some of the ideas we've discussed and talked about back and forth tonight, try to consider, is this going to be good for that cause or bad for that cause? Or is it going to have good and bad implications for what's going to happen? Let's say, this is a hypothetical. Let's say Scott Snyder creates a brand new series for Distillery that is amazing. It is that next Walking Dead. It is that next Invincible, whatever it might be. And people go nuts over it. It becomes a TV show. It becomes a movie. People, start reading Distillery comic books because of that. People start reading Image, Dynamite, DC, Marvel comic books because of that. They have their friends and loved ones start reading. They have their kids start reading. Now, that is very much a large, lofty goal to hope that happens, but it could happen. And even if that 1% of that comes true, it's a net gain for the comic book collecting community, the comic book reading community, and the comic book investing community, which sometimes we all sort of have our little infights, but we're all part of the same thing here. We're all brought together by comic books. What's good for comic books is good for all those people. It's good for retailers. It's good for distributors. It's good for a lot of people that are paid. It's good for Hollywood and the movies that they make and the TV shows they make. If there's good content and good source material that they can stay true to and deliver to people. So that's kind of my thought process here is when we read about these things, think about what some of the long-term implications are. It doesn't mean that you have to support it. It doesn't mean you have to like the ideas or how they're executing it, but try to consider, the full ramifications of an idea before you kind of form your opinion is my potential advice there.
I'm going to leave with a story, and we're not going to leave with a story. We're going to talk for a second after this, but I'm going to end this with a story. I'll never forget. I'm checking out at the grocery store. It's like 11:30 at night in a 24-hour grocery store, and I had to run in to buy some food. And I'm wearing a The Walking Dead t-shirt with Christopher Walken's face on it. And the cashier, who's a woman in her mid-60s, says to me, do you watch that show? I look down at my shirt and I go, she goes, The Walking Dead, do you watch that show? And I go, no, but I read the comic books. She goes, what happens to Shane? And I'm going, I don't follow. She goes, well, it's a comic book, right? What happens to Shane? I still don't know what you're talking about. I don't watch the show. That was such a cultural touch point that never would have happened if there wasn't a place for it, because there wasn't at Marvel and DC. That could have only happened at a place like Image, where creators were given a chance to own their content and then were given a stake in that content being successful. Robert Kirkman could have self-published The Walking Dead and shopped it around at Comic-Cons and shopped it around at Comic-Cons and shopped it around at Comic-Cons and just been an indie guy his whole life. But a place like Image existed and took a shot on it. And it was the biggest thing ever. A place like Distillery is a place like that. They're giving you an opportunity as a reader and as a fan to try something that maybe doesn't fit anywhere else in a way that doesn't fit anywhere else. You never know where that's going to come from. And so to ignore something just because it's new, just because it's different, means you're missing out.
Yeah, I will touch on some of these comments real fast, but I think it's a great echo from Comics with Bueller there about readers, collectors, and flippers are all necessary. If one of those were to be gone, the comic book industry wouldn't survive. It's just not big enough. And yeah, we're all connected in these things we love and these things we collect and read and invest in. And I try never to disparage somebody for their thoughts on how they approach these things, because high tides raise all ships, right? And that's something that's very important lesson for something that it's very fragile. I think if you paid attention the last few years, you'd see how fragile the comic book community really is. Not just on the personality side of things or the drama side of things, but also on just the market, just the health of the industry and what it needs to survive. Buddy, I think you asked a great question here about first appearances between magazines and comics. I know what you're talking about with that. I think it was a Peach Momoko cover to Star Wars Insider. Probably a great topic for us to handle on another show. But I think
Jay, write that down.
Yeah, that's a fantastic one. First appearances will, of course, come up because it's not a comic book channel or show unless you have an argument about comic book first appearances, right? I mean, that's just the rules. I don't make the rules. That's just what they
It's
are.
this one.
Okay, that's wrong, but all right. We'll give you that one.
Don't make me laugh. I'm going to choke to death.
I can't make any promises. Dan, by the way, Dan, another great member over here at the EXP. Definitely check out his content. Proposed scene for Spider-Verse. Gwen and Miles end up on a different Earth. Gwen checks comic shop locator, finds a shop, checks to see which Spidey is in the comics, and tells her the universe. That is a awesome idea. I love it.
It would have made Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness more watchable for sure.
100%. I love the comment there. That's why Dan should be hired to write a movie.
All right.
Cool.
Before we sign off, Bronze, what's happening on your channel this week?
Let's see. So I have a couple price lookbacks, which I talked about at the top of the show. I do the top 5 not to buy series. It's kind of my flagship show that I run every week. I give you the top 5 not to buy. I have another episode of that coming out, plus a couple lookbacks that are due for checking in on those prices. Because not only do I tell you, hey, I don't like the investment potential on these comic books from the top 5 or from the top lists out there, Key Collector Trending 20, CBSI top 10, Cover Price top 10. I actually go back and follow up those prices 6 months and 1 year later to see if I was right. Spoiler alert, I've been batting a pretty high average on what I've been right with, but I show all the math. I check prices on Go Collect. I check prices on Cover Price. I check prices on comicspriceguide.com, eBay sold listings, and Overstreet Access is one I've been using as well recently, which is another interesting topic and a growing app out there too. So I kind of show my math and I say, hey, this is actually what happened to these books. And sometimes I'm wrong and often I'm right, but that's what I have going on this week. So yeah, that's going to be happening over here. Kyle's going to cough for a little while, but I figured he'd have something he would want to plug here on the EXP.
Well, tomorrow night, Dan, who's in the comments, and Jay, who's been producing the show all night, we and myself are on a show called In Stores This Week, where we read books that are in stores on Wednesday. And kind of tell you what we think of them. We actually read the books and dig in a little deep and kind of talk about the backstories and, some of the production and all that kind of stuff. We get really into the weeds sometimes. This week, we're talking about Blue Book number 3, Star Wars High Republic Adventures Quest for the Jedi, which we mentioned earlier. Gargoyles number 5, which we've all been loving. TMNT 139 and Armageddon Game number 7, which are both in the Armageddon Game story arc. I think we're coming down to the end of that thing finally. Dungeons and Dragons Saturday Morning Adventures number 2 by David Boer. Neighbors number 2, which was a book that, man, that book was good, but I was angry. Dune House Harkonnen number 4, and Money Shot Comes Again number 1 from Vault.
Love that title.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks a lot, GTK Comic. I'm glad that you enjoy the discussion. Hopefully we'll see you back here every week. You can watch over on the EXP. If you're watching on my channel, please make sure to go sub up the EXP. Not only, the beautiful thing is, not only if you like the show, not only if you like my content, not only if you like Kyle and what we're bringing here and the call-ins we're going to get, which is going to be awesome. It's going to be a great part of the show. Not only if you like this stuff, do you get to come watch this show every week. They have content 7 days a week over here, guys. Every day there's comic book content, things from, you got Nick Barucci, who has an amazing collection of original artwork that you can see. You've got, people like James from Mint Hunter on here. You got 360 Comics, AR Comics are all contributing. Tons of great content. Check out the schedules, get signed up for the newsletter, and see all the amazing content you have coming to you and figure out what shows you want to check out over here.
We're the only comic book channel that has a Saturday night dance party exclusively on Twitch. So it's like AfterCon every week.
Nice. Well, that is fantastic. I think with that said, we're pretty much ready to wrap up the show. Kyle, unless you got anything else you want to talk about?
No, just as always, this show is brought to you with no commercial interruptions by Comic Shop Locator. Head over to comicsshoplocator.com and type in the zip code of the area where you are, and it will tell you where there are comic shops nearby to you. If you're traveling like I will be this weekend, I'm going to Parkersburg, West Virginia to visit Mothman, but I also want to visit some local comic shops. So I'm heading into comicsshoplocator.com. and looking for places to visit along my route. So head over to comicshoplocator.com, check those out, visit your local comic shop, and if you can, spend $5. $5 is enough to change somebody's day.
100%. Awesome. Well, thanks for watching this week, everybody. We look forward to seeing you next week. If you enjoyed the show and you thought the format was awesome and you want to be part of the conversation, remember, we will have the phone lines open, so don't be ashamed to, don't be shy to call in. We want to talk to you, and I look forward to getting a chance to discuss some of these topics with you guys in coming weeks. Thank you so much.
Join the party. Head over to our Linktree to find all the links for everywhere the experience is all the time.